Hello and welcome to today's expert series on training in the pandemic. Today is our third edition in the series in which we speak to some of the leading players from the GWO training network about best practice and innovation, helping you take sensible steps on reopening your centres after the COVID-19 lockdown. Today's guests are Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy based in Orlando, Florida. Our agenda today, there's two key elements. After I've introduced our panelists, we'll update you on the GWO network's reopening plans. This should take around 5 minutes. And then our panelists from SGRE will talk us through their own recent story and the adaptations they've made in Orlando. The slides are available now as a handout. Your microphones are muted, but when we get to the Q&A, we'll ask you to unmute so you can speak to the panelists directly. In the meantime, please go ahead and type any questions you have into the box and we'll get to them when the time comes. I'm Ralph Savage. I'll be hosting our discussion today. I've been with GWO for 2.5 years. I look after communications and stakeholder management. Andy Apila is our colleague based out of Chicago. He's worked with the GWO North America Committee since its formation last year, and he helps members with strategy and work plan implementation as the network grows in North America. Since his appointment, GWO training has continued to grow, and there are now 17 sites across the continent. One of the best things about this series for me is the caliber of panelists we've had. And our guest today, Christopher Spring, is no exception. Chris has been with SGRE since May 2019 and is described by one of his former US Navy colleagues as an intelligent and driven leader. He's had a long and varied career with the US Navy, both as a serving officer and in various teaching roles. Perhaps the coolest thing I found out is that he's the first guest we've ever had with valid top secret security clearance. So welcome to you, Chris.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.
And from our team here, Jakob Lauholst is CEO of Global Wind Organization. He's led the Secretariat since it was formed in 2014, prior to which he held leadership positions with Wind Denmark and as a board member of Wind Europe. So a warm welcome to all of our panelists. So now we'll move on to our core topic. And a quick reminder, which we do with all of these webinars, is that GWO and its members subscribe to advice provided by governments and the World Health Organization. So we're here today with Chris and with the other panelists to share knowledge and best practice. We're not here to encourage you to reopen a training center where it's not safe to do so or to contravene any advice given by your own authorities. So I hope that's straightforward enough for you. You've already heard a lot from me. Chris, I wanted to invite you to speak initially about Siemens Gamesa, the facility in Orlando. Just give us a quick overview of what goes on there.
Yes, happy to. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. So Siemens Gamesa is a training facility we've been in Orlando, Florida area for a few years now. Originally, our location was in Texas. But we have a pretty nice facility here that has 2 full-size nacelles as well as 3 climbing towers. And what really the best thing it affords us is we're right next to Orlando International Airport, so it provides quite a bit of access for all of our students to be able to get quite a few direct flights to the training facility. So we offer the full range of GWO training from BST, BTT, as well as recently we certified for advanced rescue back in September, October last year. So we run the full gambit of what we train. And then as you see, we run through quite a few number of trainings throughout the year. Not only here at the training center, but I also have mobile trainers that I send out to the field to do on-site training locally as well.
Okay, thanks, Chris. On the other side of the screen, we've got some notes which were inspired by conversations that we had. You know, if you operate in one country with, you know, one government defining lockdown regulations, that's challenging enough. You've got 50. How on earth do you keep track?
So that is definitely a very challenging thing that we have to do here within the United States. And I would also top on that Canada as well, because we're the preferred training provider for those techs that we have within our company from Canada. So to try and organize and coordinate 50 plus different restrictions and requirements is quite challenging. So we have a daily update that we compile all those restrictions and requirements that we try to navigate within. Especially depending on where those techs are coming from, that could have limitations on them coming to us, or Florida itself is, has a few number of cases. So some of those techs coming back from Florida actually has some restrictions as well. So we have to navigate that quite gingerly to make sure that we can get our techs in and out as safely as possible. We are considered critical infrastructure, so it does give us a little bit of more freedom than your standard person just traveling for leisure. But it does make it a little tricky at times.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Like our previous webinars, we're going to take a tour essentially through the facility and discuss the steps you've taken to reopen in a safe environment. Beginning with the overview, Chris, you control everything by a master process, which is headlined on the left-hand side here. Can you tell us about this?
Yes, it was definitely a group effort between not only Training Center Orlando and the North America leadership, but also the global leadership that we have in Spain and Denmark and all around the rest of the world to help put in place a bunch of control measures, not only for our factories and offices and you name it, but also for the training centers as well, that we used as a foundation to grow from. The other thing that I can't stress enough that was fantastic for us to be able to reopen here and reopen as successfully as we have is the support from management. Every single day, it's not just, we say the students to wear the equipment and follow the rules, but the managers and everyone up the chain is following that on a daily basis, hourly basis. So we never have to worry about that, setting that double standard. So I can't stress that enough. So one of the things that we did when we briefed this entire plan up, because Florida was under restrictions until May 4th, that's why we reopened then, is we want to make sure we were doing it correctly. And we also want to make sure that we briefed that there wasn't an expectation that this was going to be perfect. We were going to remove as much hazard as possible. We were going to mitigate those risks as much as possible, but there still was a possibility of infection. So with that in mind, and also with the transient nature, because as you said, we've got 50 states that we have techs, in all different areas. I have a lot of people coming in here that I don't know where they've been, what they've been in contact, everything else. And it doesn't make sense logically nor financially to stick them in a hotel room and try and isolate them for 14 days because one, that's a huge cost to the budgets, but then two, to expect somebody to stay in a hotel room for 14 days is, I think, not logical because they're not gonna maintain that isolation. So, it's definitely making sure that those assumptions and those ideas were laid out at the very, very beginning. All students that come to me are pre-screened. So before they even start organizing their travel, they'll get an initial screening, a self-screening that we provide to them and they sign. And then they also refresh that just before they travel. And then we also have questions that we'll ask them as soon as they arrive here. We have actually minimized, and we'll talk about here next slide as well, the travel. We're trying to minimize as much airports as possible actually right now and do a lot of actual driving, which makes it difficult because the United States is a pretty big place.
Should we move on to the travel guidelines or?
Yes, yeah, go ahead, that's fine. Because the other ones are kind of, expectations. And that was actually a struggle too with as far as the PPE is making sure that you have that PPE that you feel is necessary is to have that in stock is quite a challenge. And that took us almost a month to assemble enough PPE. We started early April in order to have that for a May 4th opening. So that's something to pay attention to. Hopefully in your countries and your locations, it's a little bit easier. Depending on what you're trying to get here in the States, it can be tricky. So we've had to definitely use a whole bunch of different resources and channels. So for the travel guidelines here that he has up on screen, again, we have an established protocol that we use throughout the entire company internationally that has a mandatory 4 questions that students have to, or any traveler has to do. As far as being no symptoms for the last 15 days, no contact confirmed or suspected confirmed passengers, no leisure travel through airports or known hotspots. And then again, they refresh that immediately before they travel again. Even with that in mind and all that pre-screening in place, I still make the assumption that as soon as they walk through that front door of my training facility, everyone is infected. because if I can get my instructors and my students into that mentality, then they will minimize how much the possibility that one of them, if they do come in infected, will spread it to others. So that to me was important, was to try and get that proper mindset that you have to assume everybody is contaminated, and you can never let your guard down, because all it takes is one instance of, you know, touching your face at the wrong time, touching a wrong object, and transferring that across from person to person. So again, we stress driving as much as possible. We do that because, you know, when they're traveling, they can almost self-isolate during that period of time. So it's very important to us to be able to have at least that. So that's part of the reason why, you know, or part of what we want to do with the PPE is make sure not only have it here at the training center, but make sure you have it at the sites too. So that way students can safely get to the training center without hopefully picking up something along the way or on their return as well. And then we also have a training that we've provided to all those students as far as how to manage gas stations, how to manage food and restaurants and stuff like that safely, to make sure that they minimize their exposure as much as possible.
Yeah, there's so much, so many activities that people take for granted in normal life now have to essentially take a responsibility for as the people who are going to be hosting them for the next few days, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So students have to stick to an assigned arrival time. The first point here for check-in. What's the result of that? How's that been working out for you for the first couple of weeks?
So it's actually been really fantastic. The students have been really good with it. Sometimes we'll have students who will arrive a little early, but they stay outside in their vehicles before they come in. So they've been really good as far as arriving at their designated times. That's one thing that we do immediately check to verify. We have a written out procedure for no matter what manager is sitting at the front for that morning to make sure that they're in their assigned time. Then they immediately, and it's after the first day, it's all clockwork. They know immediately go in, wash their hands. We have 2 restrooms right at the very front here. We have the World Health Organization guidance as far as how to properly wash your hands posted up in both of those restrooms. They do that, they come out, they gather their PPE. We have everything in an order along the table you see there in front, from gloves, safety glasses, work gloves, and then masks if they need that as well. We try to teach them how to recycle and reuse masks in accordance with Centers for Disease Control, which is United States guidance, or a few other medical universities guidance as far as how to safely reuse some of those masks and stuff like that. And then last item is we do a temperature check on every single person, whether it be staff or student, when they come into the facility, to make sure that they're not feverish.
And then we've got a list of control measures here. We've seen or learned various sort of versions of these from our other case studies in the last couple of weeks, but the ones that stick out for me are your approach to PFPE isolation for 72 hours and also the 7-day-a-week opening that we've already discussed. What can you tell us about those?
Yes, so definitely, and we'll show some pictures here, especially on the PFPE. So our concern with the PPE specifically was how do we properly decontaminate this? Because it's not a single type item. It's not all plastic. It's not all metals. There's too many nooks and crannies and hard to reach spots. So how do we effectively sanitize this from student to student? And the only way that we could effectively do that without causing additional damage to the PPE and additional wear and tear was to isolate. So that's what we did. Is we have a setup right now where we put away all the PPE. Each student uses it for their time here, but then when they're done, we hang it up and we segregate it off from the rest of the training facility over in a corner for 72 hours at the least before we reintroduce it back into the supply to reissue.
And anything else on these control measures that you think is important to get across? Like I said, staggering lunch breaks is becoming quite a universal activity. Your instructor-student ratio of 1 to 3 is actually slightly lower than some have implemented. So European Wind Academy in Poland last week have moved from a 1 to 4 up to 1 to 6 for their classroom based training. So what's behind the thinking there?
Yes, so the 1 to 3 is we're definitely wanting to follow along with the GWO recommendations of the 1 to 3 instructor-to-student ratio. That's what our global headquarters is also on board with, and we as well, because our initial thought is this is something not a lot of people have done before as far as having to operate within a contaminated environment or potentially contaminated environment with all of this PPE while also still climbing and trying to be safe and conduct the training that we have to. So we felt that keeping our student to instructor ratio low allows us to have more contact time between student and instructor and allows more observation, so we can try and get those muscle movements right the first time and get those good habits established before we start ramping up the student load. That is something that we will be reviewing over the next several weeks. Is are we comfortable, and do we have enough procedures and policies in place to support a ramp up in student load?
But in the meantime, you're maintaining the 7-day-a-week training cycle to accommodate numbers while keeping the ratio low.
That's correct. So right now we're actually coming to the end of our first 7-day work week cycle, if you will. So we did this for 21 days, so 3 total weeks. We're going to have a bit of a pause for 2 or 3 days, and then we're going to jump back in. June is going to be, some of it will be 7-day work weeks, and some of it will be back to a traditional 5-day work week, just based on student load, trying to get through. But the intention right now is at least June we'll still maintain the 1 to 3 instructor to student ratio. We're looking right now at July.
One final thing.
Question here. A question on the number of students. So the ratio, I understand. So how many people, as I recall, your training center, you have 6 or 8 ladders or some around that. Do you have people on all 8 ladders at the same time, or what is your?
No, so we have, and we'll show you a picture here in a second as far as a working at heights class that we ran, and we keep it to one student on a ladder at a time. So if we have 2 working at heights classes running, then obviously we'll have a second instructor and a second student on a ladder, but those ladders are not next to each other. They're tens of feet apart, or 20 or 30, 40 feet apart. Because the one thing to think about too is everybody's talking about either a 2 meter or a 6 foot, depending on where you're at, goal to try and keep between people. Well, that's all based on the normal height of a human being. But when you start putting a student 20, 30 feet in the air, that cone dramatically increases. So one of the PPE that I have for my safety instructors is we got full face shields that work with our helmets to make sure that they have an additional layer while those students are up in the air.
Okay, thanks.
Happy.
Okay.
Yep. So you kind of touched on it as far as the lunches. Some of the things that we learned too. Initially, our plan was to bring students through a single room, pick up their lunches. Everything is pre-boxed. We've actually shifted to where the lunches, we bring them to the classroom. So our goal is to try and have those students minimize their foot traffic through our training facility as much as possible. So we found that works pretty well as well. And then just like I said, is PPE, you have to have enough of it out in multiple stations throughout the facility to allow people to effectively use it. Because you have to lower that barrier, you have to lower the cost or the effort that requires for them to do it, for them to actually be willing to do it every time. And that's what it takes.
And the next slide we've got shows where and what types of PPE is required. Do you want to talk us through this guide?
Yes. So again, our base assumption that we talked about is, since we couldn't do any sort of isolation period, as soon as they fly in or drive in, there's no way I could effectively do a 14-day plus isolation. So I have to assume that everybody, whether it be student or instructor, is potentially contaminated or asymptomatic. So that's why you'll see here some of this PPE requirements. It is pretty aggressive, but it's also what allows us to operate and keep that mentality. So at the front reception area where our first initial contact is, and we're not understanding, if they're feverish or anything like that, we have a full kit on as far as face shield, goggles, mask, respirator, gloves, and we also minimize our contact time with them within 6 feet as much as possible, using physical barriers, the desks, you name it. Bathrooms, we drop that down a little bit just because using gloves is a little difficult when you're in a restroom, and you can also wash hands. Now, one thing to think about though is, at least in the United States, most restroom doors open in and you got to grab a handle to leave. Well, you just washed your hands and now you touched a handle that everybody touches. So what I do with the high bay is I assume that everybody who's going out there, because they're working hard, they should be wearing a mask, but they might still be expressing droplets. I make the assumption that everything out there is contaminated and everything is potentially a hazard. So that's why we have full kit when we're out in the high bay, as well as the classrooms, because that's the primary contact area with the students. We do allow at lunchtime, obviously you have to reduce a little bit to eat. How we handle that is no one can reduce their PPE until everyone has their food in front of them and everybody is sitting down. And then once that happens, people can lower their masks, lower their gloves and stuff like that. So that way you're minimizing transmission. And then cubicles for those of us, the instructors and items that when they're in an area where they have a 6 foot space and they can keep that segregation, they can reduce some of their requirements as well.
Is there much guidance that you're giving? You know, the example that you gave, you know, once everybody's received their meal, they're able to begin. I mean, are you literally telling them now you can begin, or are you instructing them beforehand and they interpret it, or, you know, how much of the principles you have to be?
So a great example is this slide, and a whole bunch of others are actually part of a training slide deck that I've created for my instructors to present to the students on their very first day. Also, every location that you go into, whether it be a classroom, the high bay, hallways, if you're transitioning from one space to another, there is a sign on that door or portal that says you must have this PPE before you enter this space. That way it is extremely clear. And usually also if it's a transition that requires a increase or a decrease in that PPE, there is a station right there that has that required PPE change, whether it be masks, gloves, you name it. Every transition area has a station with it to allow them, so they don't have to keep packing it around with them. It's right there. Okay.
So the facilities is one thing. Next is actually delivering the training. So we'll move on to, first of all, the classroom layout. They come in lots of different shapes and sizes. Is this an example of the 1:3 ratio in the picture on the right, Chris?
Yes, so both of them are actually. So these are two great examples of my core classrooms that I utilize. So I have a primary classroom there on the right-hand side. That's for almost any type of class, fire awareness, manual handling, working heights, you name it. This one here, it has 2 students to 1 instructor. As you see, everybody's well spaced apart. Those are the locations. They do not get closer to each other during that training. I also have 2 doors for this particular classroom, which is why we picked it. So we allow people to come in one way and they can leave another, so that way you don't have a whole lot of cross traffic through a tiny area. The classroom on the left is our BTT classroom. So this one has a lot of our electrical and hydraulics and other simulators kind of off to the left there, but we spaced apart the tables. So that way the students are at least 6 feet apart. So those center tables in each one of those 2 rows are unoccupied all the time. So there's only students at those 4 corner tables. And then as you see, the instructor, he's way up in the front to allow sufficient spacing as well.
And then the photograph that you mentioned you wanted to show us before from the working at height class, what can you tell us about what's happening here?
Yes, so this is a couple great pictures from a working at heights class that we had just last week. So specifically, we're following the recommended guidance from GWO as well as my corporate headquarters for using, minimizing as much student-on-student contact as possible. So we're utilizing mannequins for the rescues now for the working at heights. One thing that my instructors came up with, which I thought was an amazing idea and one that I wanted to express. So we use Skylotech Milans for our rescue devices. One of them is the A29, which allows you to do rescue ups. So it's an electric drill, and we actually hook that down. If you see my instructor on the picture on the right with the orange helmet, he has the rescue device tied off there, and we have it going up to a pulley at the top and then coming back down. And that's how we use to raise the mannequin up into position. The student will hook them up in whatever distress position that they are, whether it's on the fall arrest, work position, you name it. But that way it minimizes how much manual handling and excess strain and everything else that my instructors are gonna have to do or students have to do to get 130, 180 pound mannequin up into a position that is not helping you get it into that position. So I thought that was a great thing that they thought up and something I want to just show what we're doing to make that work.
Are you finding that the lessons are taking a little bit longer just because of the manual labor required to lift mannequins into position, Chris?
Definitely, it is. Now, obviously, classes are running a little shorter just because we're running a smaller classes, so they kind of balance each other out, but they are running longer. One of the things, too, that we did initially kind of schedule or plan for, but we've learned is obviously when you're up working and you're causing, getting strain and you're wearing a mask, it reduces how much airflow you have in and out, so people get tired a little quicker. So we've actually started doing more breaks with the students And also how we do with the breaks is we don't just have them just sit, still wear their mask. We go back to the classroom, we sit down. Once everybody sit down, we allow them to take the mask off, kind of catch a breath without it. And then 10 minutes later, we get back to it again. So that's something to think about too, is you may have to book a few more kind of either water breaks or just breathing breaks throughout your day to allow the students to be able to keep up with the training. So that's definitely something to think about.
So just a couple more examples here from your fire awareness training. It doesn't look very inviting to go inside there, but there are some adaptations that you've made. Tell us
Yes.
what's going on.
So we have to go full simulation just because the city of Orlando doesn't like us to light things on fire. So we have all sorts of Bolex fire screens, smoke simulators. We have a heater in there to give them a heat blast as well. But more importantly, what we've had to modify with this, with regards to COVID, is this used to be a 2-student operation. So we'd put them out in the hub. That's when we'd initiate the simulated fire, and they would have to use a fire extinguisher and evacuate themselves out in a team effort, because they normally would work in a team of 2. But now, because we can't do that, what we're doing is we have 2 big duffel bags filled with some old PPE that simulates a unconscious coworker. So they have to evacuate themselves and drag those 2 big duffel bags as well, and kind of navigate through there. So that way we don't have student-on-student contact within such a tight and confined space.
Okay.
Cool. Very cool.
And then, is that a question from you, Jakob? Or?
No, I just said that's very cool. Good thinking.
So this is the point that you mentioned earlier on about quarantine and the 72-hour quarantine process. Something that you mentioned in a conversation we had previously was that you were able to transfer some of this learning from your experience in decontaminating or developing processes for decontamination in the nuclear area. Is that something that's relevant?
I mean, honestly, yes. I was surprised at how directly relatable it was. So I spent 9 years working nuclear power and engineering for the U.S. Navy. And definitely one of the things that was very tantamount was the prevention of the spread of radioactive contamination, and how meticulous you have to be to prevent that. And this virus is this very same thing with what we're learning as far as how long stay times are on various materials and everything else. You have to treat that as same as you would contamination, because you can't really see contamination either. It's there, it's still dangerous, but you can't tell it's there really. So you have to have all the same safety and controls and mitigations in place. So it's directly relatable, the experience that you would learn in the nuclear industry for what we use to minimize exposure to both instructor and students here. So what you see is a great example of what my instructors are doing right now. So the students, when they get ready for a course, they are issued PFPE. So we used to allow them into our cage with all our equipment and kind of pick what they want. We don't do that anymore. So we bring them their PFPE, the entire kit, the harness, the fall arrest, you name it, and we say, this is yours for your training event here. They wear that. So if it's a multi-day event, they will hang their equipment on one rack, spaced apart, and that is their equipment and their equipment only. No one is allowed to touch it. Once the training is complete, we will wheel that whole cart over. As you see here off to the side, especially on that left picture, you can see a little person in the far right-hand corner of that picture, how far away it is from the actual active training towers. So we make sure that we have, as you can see there, it's probably 60 to 100 feet at least distance between any active training areas. So that way we can ensure that the students don't go near it. And then on the actual equipment, we hang a sign that indicates when the training was complete, what day, time, and then who is responsible for that equipment itself.